The deed to Harlan's Crossing Ranch is a single page of yellowed paper with a notary stamp so faded it is nearly illegible, and Iris Calloway holds it in both hands on the stage road outside the county clerk's office and reads it twice before she allows herself to believe it is real. $5. She paid $5 for a working ranch with a house and a barn and 40 acres of good Kansas ground, and the clerk who processed the transaction did so with the expression of a man who has decided, after too many years behind a government desk in a territory full of people making decisions, they will regret that his job description does not extend to warning them. "You understand the property has been vacant," he said. She told him she understood. For some time, he said. She told him she understood that too. He stamped the paper and slid it across the counter, and she took it and walked out into the October sun and stood on the road, holding her deed and her $5 remaining, and the particular stubbornness that has gotten her through the last 8 months since her husband died and left her with nothing but his name and his debts, and it turned out this distant relative's forgotten property that nobody in 3 counties wanted badly enough to pay $6 for. The ranch is 14 miles from town, which is far enough to feel the full weight of the distance on the ride out. The road narrows to a track after the first 8 miles, and the track gives out entirely with 2 miles still to go, and she navigates the final stretch by the deed's rough description of the property line, arriving at Harlan's Crossing in the blue early dusk of a Kansas October, with just enough light left to see the house standing solid against the darkening sky. The barn behind it in better repair than any vacant property has a right to be, and the land around it flat, wide, richly grassed, even in late autumn, good enough to explain why anyone would have built here in the first place, if not quite good enough to explain why everyone who did eventually left. She spends the first evening making the house livable in the most essential sense. A fire in the stove, water from a pump that still works despite the years of disuse. A meal cold enough to remind her that tomorrow she needs to buy supplies from somewhere. The house itself she examines by lamplight with the methodical attention of a woman taking inventory of an asset, moving from room to room, noting what is sound and what needs work, opening closets and cupboards, and finding them still half-stocked with the belongings of whoever left without packing. There is something she has come to recognize. In the months since her husband's death forced her into a series of unfamiliar spaces, as the particular sadness of other people's abandoned things. The way a half-used candle or a pair of reading spectacles left on a shelf carries the specific weight of a life interrupted. She touches none of it, she catalogs it, and moves on. She sleeps badly. Her first 2 nights, not from fear but from the accumulated strain of the past months, the grief and the debts and the long series of practical decisions that have brought her to a house 14 miles from the nearest town with $5 in her coat and a deed stamped by a clerk who expected to see her back in a month, asking if he knew anyone who might buy it cheap. She lies awake cataloging what she needs to do in the first week: firewood supplies, the barn roof's one soft spot that let light through when she examined it, and falls asleep somewhere in the middle of the list, which is a reasonable way to manage a situation that would defeat a person who allowed themselves to think about the whole of it at once. She finds the loose plaster on the east wall of the front room on her second morning, not because she is looking for it, but because the morning light coming through the east window falls on it at an angle that shows the irregularity clearly. A section of wall where the plaster has been applied over something that changed the surface beneath it, creating a faint rectangular outline, perhaps 18 inches across and 12 inches tall. She presses her palm against it and feels the give of it. Not the solid resistance of proper lathing, but a slight hollow quality, and she gets a kitchen knife and scores along the outline, carefully. And the section comes away in one piece to reveal a cavity in the wall, neatly framed, clearly constructed deliberately rather than accidentally, and inside it, wrapped in oilskin that has kept them near perfect despite the years, a stack of notebooks. She counts them on the kitchen table before she opens any of them. 11 notebooks, cloth-bound, their covers identical in size and style. She opens the topmost one and finds the first entry dated in a careful, deliberate hand. March 14th, Byte, 1844. I have decided to keep this record because there is no one here to speak to who would understand what I am trying to understand. And writing it down is the next best thing to being understood. She sets that notebook down and opens the last one, the one at the bottom of the stack, and finds its final entry dated October 9th, 1891, and her hands go still on the page because October 9th, 1891 is today. Today is the day she arrived at Harlan's Crossing Ranch. She is the first person to have been in this house in 11 years. The clerk confirmed that himself. She reads the entry. A woman came today, it says, in the same careful, deliberate hand that wrote the first entry 47 years before. Fair-haired, arrived near dusk, came alone. She stood in the front room for a long time before she lit the lamp. She will find this soon. I want her to understand what she has found before she decides what to do with it. She sits with the notebooks on the kitchen table for a long time before she does anything else. The fire in the stove burns down without her tending it, and the room cools around her, and she does not notice either of these things, being entirely occupied with the problem of what she is holding in her hands and what it means. The notebooks are real. The handwriting is consistent throughout, the same person across 47 years of entries. The paper aged appropriately for the dates written on it. The final entry was written today in a house that has been empty for 11 years. Describing her arrival in terms specific enough, fair-haired, alone, stood in the front room before lighting the lamp, that she cannot dismiss it as coincidence or prior knowledge. Whatever wrote that entry knew she was coming before she arrived and knew things about her arrival that no one who had not witnessed it could have known. She gets up from the table and lights a second lamp and carries both of them into the front room and sets one on each side of the east wall, examining the cavity she found with the attention of a woman who has decided that physical evidence is where she will begin. The cavity is neat, its edges squared, the oilskin wrapping on the notebooks carefully fitted and sealed. This was not done in haste or desperation. Whoever built this hiding place built it with care and time and the intention that what was placed inside it would survive. The plaster applied over it was matched to the surrounding wall with enough skill that she would not have found it without the specific angle of morning light that revealed the seam. Someone wanted the notebooks to survive intact. Someone also wanted them to be found eventually, or they would have matched the plaster more exactly and left no seam to catch the light at all. She opens the first notebook again and begins at the beginning, because whatever is happening in this house, she decides she will understand it before she reacts to it. And understanding it requires knowing where it started. Margaret Voss. The name signed at the bottom of the first entry and every entry thereafter came to Harlan's Crossing Ranch in the spring of 1844 as a new bride, accompanying her husband James Voss, who had bought the land from a territorial land office in the optimistic expectation that good Kansas ground would make good Kansas cattle ranchers out of people who had previously been shopkeepers in Ohio. The early entries are the entries of a woman making the best of a difficult adjustment, practical and sometimes wry, and occasionally genuinely joyful in the way of someone who has decided that wherever she is where she intends to bloom. She writes about the work, the cattle, her husband's persistence, the neighbors who ride over from miles away to introduce themselves. She writes about the house and its rooms and the way the Kansas light changes everything it touches through the eastern window in the mornings. She is a good writer, precise and unshowy, and Iris finds herself reading not for information, but for the company of a voice she is already beginning to feel she knows. The early notebooks carry the texture of a real life, which is to say, they contain not only the remarkable things, but the ordinary ones, the tedium of particular seasons, the frustration with particular cattle, the small satisfactions of a garden that produces more than expected, or a fence that holds through a hard winter without needing repair. Margaret writes about loneliness honestly and without self-pity. The loneliness of a woman intelligent enough to want conversation that matches her and isolated enough to rarely have it. She is, Iris thinks, reading through the second notebook by the light of a lamp burning lower than she remembers filling it. The kind of person who would have been a close friend if they had ever occupied the same year, which they have not, and which she finds, sitting in the house this woman kept for 47 years, genuinely sad. The strangeness begins in the second notebook, autumn of 1847. Margaret writes that she has begun to hear, on certain nights, a sound she cannot account for, coming from inside the east wall of the front room. Not a structural sound, not the settling of timber or the movement of something nesting in the plaster. A deliberate sound, almost like someone on the other side of the wall pressing their palm flat against the surface, slowly, and then withdrawing it. She has told James. He has checked the wall and found nothing and attributed it to her imagination, kindly but firmly, in the way of a husband who loves his wife and cannot afford, in a working ranch's demanding seasons, for her to be frightened of walls. She has written it down instead, in her notebook, as she writes everything down that she cannot speak about usefully to anyone else. James Voss dies in 1858, a horse accident, and after the grief entries there is a change in the notebooks, a sharpening of attention, as though the loss of her husband has freed Margaret to observe her situation with greater specificity than she permitted herself when she had someone else's peace of mind to protect. The sound in the east wall becomes a presence she describes at length methodically, noting its frequency, its quality, the conditions under which it appears. She does not name it. She does not claim to know what it is. She simply records it, for years, with the patience of a scientist who has accepted that some phenomena require more observation than a human lifetime normally allows. The middle notebooks from the 1860s show a woman who has settled into a kind of arrangement with whatever shares the house with her. She describes it the way a naturalist describes a creature she has been observing long enough to understand its patterns, with the professional satisfaction of increased knowledge and the personal warmth of long acquaintance. She writes about the sound in the wall the way she writes about the creek that runs along the property's edge, as a feature of the landscape that has its own rhythms and its own logic and is best understood by patient attention over time. By the late 1860s, she has stopped mentioning it at all in most entries, which Iris reads not as absence, but as integration, the wall and its occupant having become as ordinary and unremarkable to Margaret as the furniture. The later notebooks grow stranger in the way that a very long patience sometimes arrives at a very strange place. By the 1870s, Margaret is writing about a quality of knowing that has developed in her over the years, a sense of things before they happen that she does not attribute to supernatural agency, but to the accumulated attention of a person who has spent decades observing a single place with complete concentration. She writes in 1874 that she has begun to keep a secondary record in her notebooks, notes not about what has already happened, but about what she believes will happen, and that this secondary record has, over the 7 years since she began keeping it, proven accurate enough to unsettle her considerably and accurate enough to make her wonder whether what she is writing down is prediction or something she has simply decided to call that for want of a better word. Owen Pruitt rides up on her 5th day, the same studied approach from the yard's edge that she has begun to understand as the standard greeting of everyone who knows what she has moved into. He is foreman at the millstone spread 3 miles north, sun-weathered and light-haired and sparing with his words in a way that suggests he considers them a resource to be managed carefully rather than spent freely. You found the notebooks, he says, when she comes out to meet him, and it is not a question. She asks him how he knew. He tells her that everyone who has bought this ranch in the last 20 years has found them usually within the first week, because Margaret apparently hid them in a way that was meant to be found rather than truly concealed. She asks him why no one who found them stayed. He is quiet a moment before he answers. Because of the last entry, he says. Because it describes whoever finds them specifically enough that they understand Margaret could not have written it unless she already knew they were coming. And most people faced with evidence of that kind prefer to leave rather than try to understand it. She tells him she is not most people. He looks at her for a moment with an expression she cannot quite read. The expression of a man receiving information he has been waiting some time to receive and is now quietly verifying against what he hoped to find. No, he says. Margaret said you would not be. The sentence lands like something dropped from a height. And she stands in her own yard, absorbing it while Owen Pruitt waits with the patient economy of a man who has said the necessary thing and is now simply giving her the time she needs to do something with it. She asks him how he knows what Margaret said. He tells her that there are 2 entries in the final year of the notebooks that he has been told about secondhand by the last person who bought and read and then left this ranch, entries that describe a foreman from the neighboring spread who will in some unspecified future be the one to tell the woman who finally stays that Margaret knew she was coming. He has been watching for that woman, he says, since he was told about the entries, which was 11 years ago. She is quiet a moment. You have been watching this empty property for 11 years waiting for the right person to move into it, she says. He considers this characterization more or less, he says. Before he rides out, he tells her Millstone is 3 miles north, that she is welcome there any time, and that he would be glad to ride with her when she is ready to talk to Cecily Ward, the only other living person who knew Margaret directly, who has been waiting in her own way almost as long as he has. She finds Cecily Ward through Owen and rides with her to the small town of Graves Crossing, where Cecily lives in a neat house at the edge of the settlement. A woman in her mid-80s who answers the door as though she was expecting the knock, which Iris has begun to suspect is simply how things happen in proximity to anything related to Margaret Voss. Cecily was Margaret's younger sister, separated by 12 years, and she speaks of Margaret with the particular combination of grief and exasperation that belongs specifically to the relationship between a practical younger sibling and an older one who spent her life doing something the practical sibling found simultaneously admirable and incomprehensible. She has read the diaries, Cecily tells Iris. Margaret sent her copies of the early notebooks before she hid the originals in the wall, and she has spent the 41 years since Margaret's disappearance in 1880 reading and rereading them. She asks Cecily about the disappearance itself because the diaries do not address it directly. Cecily's face shifts at the question in a way that tells Iris it is one she has lived with for 4 decades without arriving at a satisfying answer. Margaret was found to be simply gone one morning in April of 1880 by a neighbor who rode over to check on her after several days without contact. The house was in order, nothing disturbed, no sign of struggle or illness or any reason a person would leave. She had left food on the stove that had cooked down to ash over what the neighbor estimated were several days of burning. Her horse was still in the barn. Her coat and her boots were still by the door. She left, apparently, in whatever she was wearing indoors in April and was never found. Margaret did not flee, Cecily says simply. Margaret finished. I believe she stayed as long as she intended to stay, and then she was done, and she went wherever that kind of completion goes, when it is finished with the part that a body can do. What Margaret believed, Cecily says carefully, was that the ranch sat on a particular kind of ground, not haunted ground in the usual sense. Margaret disliked that word and avoided it in her notebooks. Haunted implies something unhappy, something that cannot leave or will not rest. What Margaret described was not unhappy. It was simply very old and very attentive and operating according to a logic that human experience does not provide good language for. She believed, Cecily continues, that whatever was in that ground was aware of time in a way that living things are not, that it experienced past and present and future not as a sequence, but as a simultaneous condition, and that this was why she was able to write in her diaries about things that had not yet happened. She was not predicting. She was simply writing down what the ground already knew. Margaret wrote the last entry in 1879, Cecily tells her, a year before she disappeared. She wrote several entries that year about a woman who would come to the ranch long after she was gone, fair-haired and alone, and arrived near dusk in October, and she wrote that she wanted the woman who found the notebooks to understand that whatever she had spent her life sitting with at Harlan's Crossing Ranch was not dangerous. It was only old and lonely in the particular way of something that experiences all of time at once and has therefore always known exactly how long it would be waiting. The human trouble, when it arrives as it always does in the form of a well-dressed man, with a polite manner and a calculation already completed behind his eyes. Victor Hale of the Hale Development Company comes on her second week, introducing himself as a man with a substantial interest in the rail corridor that his survey suggests will run directly through or adjacent to Harlan's Crossing, making her $5 worth of land, worth considerably more to someone positioned correctly. He names a figure. She declines it. He smiles, the smile of a man who has heard the word no enough times to have developed a sophisticated relationship with it. Of course, Mrs. Calloway, he says, take the time you need. He glances, as he leaves, toward the east wall of the house. A deliberate glance, she notes, from a man who knows where to look. She asks Owen, after Hale's visit, whether the Hale Development Company has had dealings with this property before. Owen confirms that Hale's father purchased Harlan's Crossing in the 20 years after Margaret's disappearance and sold it again within 3 months, and that the son has been watching the property since the rail surveys were published 2 years prior. There are more entries in the final year's notebooks that she has not yet read. Owen tells her carefully more specific ones about what comes next. You should read them all before you decide anything, he says. She already knows she will. She reads everything in the following week, the full 47 years, and reads the final year's entries twice. There is an entry about a man with a development company who will come with an offer and a history with the property. There is an entry about cut fences and spooked cattle and nighttime riders on the property line, which have not yet happened as she reads but begin happening within the fortnight, as though the diary is simply a slightly ahead account of events already in motion. There is an entry about a deputy and a courtroom and a verdict. She sits with these future entries for several evenings in a row, approaching them the way she approaches every difficult thing, with patience and the willingness to look at something directly until it gives up whatever it is actually trying to say. What strikes her most is not that they are accurate, though they appear to be. What strikes her most is the tone. The future entries are the entries of a woman who has spent so long in a state of expanded perception that she is no longer describing experience so much as simply recording what she knows. The way you record the weather, factually, without drama. She has stopped being surprised by anything she writes. There is something in this quality, Iris decides, that is less frightening than it is simply very, very old. At the very end of the final year's entries, there is an entry addressed directly to her. Margaret writes, as though she knows not just that this woman will come, but that she will read this far, that she wants to say something directly. She writes that whatever is in the ground at Harlan's Crossing asked her, in the only way it had available to communicate, to find someone who would stay, not someone who would study it or name it or report it to anyone in a position to make decisions about it, but someone who would simply stay, the way you stay with something old and alone and worthy of company. She writes that she spent 47 years providing that company and does not regret a single year of it. She writes that whatever is in this ground gave her, in exchange for her company, the ability to write things she had not yet experienced, but knew were true, and that she spent her last years filling the final notebooks with these known but not yet experienced things in the hope that whoever read them would find them useful. She hopes, Margaret writes in the very last line of the very last page, that whoever this is, she will be happy here. I was, Margaret writes, for all the strangeness of it. I was. Iris sits with this final entry for a long time before she closes the notebook. Hale's harassment escalates in the weeks that follow in the predictable pattern of a man who expected easier compliance. She keeps her own ledger alongside Margaret's diaries now, filling it with dates and times and specific descriptions of everything that constitutes deliberate interference with her property, the riders at the property line, the spooked cattle found scattered each morning, the cut fences found twice with clean diagonal cuts, and the second time, a tool left behind in the frozen grass carrying the mark of Hale's supply depot in letters clear enough to read by morning light without straining. She keeps the ledger with the same precision she keeps everything else. And when she reads it back to herself on the mornings after the worst nights, she finds that the act of writing it down steadies her in the same way Margaret described the act of writing steadying her. The formless dread of a difficult situation becoming something with dates and margins, something she can close inside a book and address tomorrow rather than simply endure tonight. She rides to town with Owen when she has enough to make the ride worthwhile, the tool in her saddlebag and her ledger open on her knee for the last mile, and the deputy there, a man named Thomas Vey who has the look of someone who has been waiting for precisely this kind of documented complaint about precisely this kind of operation, accepts it with the attention it deserves. The trial, when it comes, is not long. Hale is a man who has always been careful to keep his name off the specific instructions he gives. But he has not been careful enough to anticipate that one of the men he sent to cut her fences would be caught at another property in the county the same week, doing the same work on the same orders, and that this man would find his loyalty to Hale's payroll less durable than his interest in avoiding serious charges. The verdict costs Hale his rail corridor claims in the county and a fine that the courtroom observers receive, with the satisfaction of people who have been watching this particular operation grow too comfortable for too long. Iris testifies calmly, her ledger entries read into the record with the same precision she brought to maintaining them, saying nothing whatsoever about the notebooks in the wall or Margaret Voss or anything she has spent the past weeks learning about the ground she is standing on. That part of her life at Harlan's Crossing is hers, and is not relevant to any proceedings a territorial court is equipped to conduct. The weeks after the verdict bring the particular piece of a property whose human troubles have been resolved and whose older ones have not, which is to say an ordinary piece, the piece of a working ranch in late autumn, with the winter coming and much to do. Owen stays close, and the staying has become, without either of them naming it, something they have both accepted as a fact rather than a decision still being made. Iris continues reading the notebooks, not forward through the future entries she has already read, but back through the early ones, letting Margaret's voice become familiar in the way that voices in good books become familiar, present even when the book is closed. She has started keeping her own entries in a new notebook she bought in town, writing about the ranch and the season and the work, and Owen and the sound she occasionally hears from the east wall, which she has not replastered since she opened it, the faint slow pressure of something that might be a palm against the plaster from the other side. She writes about it the way Margaret wrote about it, without naming it, without deciding what it is, simply noting it precisely, in case it matters to whoever reads it next. One evening, reading back through her own new entries for the first week, and comparing them to the corresponding entries in Margaret's notebooks from her own first year at the ranch, she finds something that makes her set both books down and look out the window at the dark yard for a long while. The observations are not identical, but they are more similar than they ought to be. The descriptions of the same house and the same seasons from two women separated by nearly 50 years, arriving at the same words in the same order to describe things that neither of them fully understands, and both of them have decided to record anyway. She writes that observation down in her notebook too. It seems like the kind of thing Margaret would have wanted on record. Owen asks her to marry him on a clear, cold evening in January, standing in the front room with the notebooks on the table and the fire in the stove and the east wall, solid and ordinary beside them, and she says yes with the unhesitating certainty of a woman who has, over the past several months, done enough sitting with uncertainty of far larger kinds that this one particular question does not require much deliberation at all. She notices, saying yes, that the east wall is quiet tonight. She has come to think of this as the equivalent of a room's temperature, a condition that tells her something about the general state of the house. Quiet tonight means settled, she has decided. It does not mean absent. They plan the wedding for the spring at the ranch, which is the only suitable place. The ceremony is held in the yard on a warm April afternoon, with a small gathering of neighbors and the deputy and Cicely Ward making the long journey from Graves Crossing, which Iris notices is also described in the final year of the notebooks. A small ceremony in April with an elderly woman traveling a long distance to attend. She has stopped being surprised by these correspondences and has started simply noting them with the same precise attention she gives everything else about this property and its relationship to time. The afternoon passes with the specific warmth of an occasion that the people in it have earned and by the time the guests take their leave in the blue evening, and she and Owen are left alone in the quiet yard, she finds that she has not thought about the east wall for the entirety of the ceremony and the hours that followed it, which is, she thinks, the most complete peace she has known since her arrival. The night after the wedding, Iris sits alone in the front room while Owen sleeps, not from restlessness, but from intention. The same quiet intention with which Margaret sat with whatever occupies the ground beneath this house for 47 years. She opens the last notebook to a page she has left blank, past the final entry Margaret wrote, and she takes her pen, and she writes, October 9th, 1891. The day I arrived. She pauses, looking at what she has written, the date already written in this book before she arrived, to write it, the strange loop of it, something she has decided to simply inhabit rather than resolve. Then she writes, I want to say to whoever reads this that I found what Margaret left me, and I read it all, and I chose to stay. I do not know what is here. I do not think the knowing of it is the point. I think the staying is the point. I have started a new notebook of my own, and I intend to keep it the way she kept hers, as honestly and precisely as I can, for as long as I am here. She closes the notebook and sits in the quiet of the house and listens to the east wall, which is silent tonight, the silence of something that has made itself comfortable for the evening and does not need to be checked on. She leaves the lamp burning low on the table the way Margaret must have left it on 10,000 similar evenings, and sits in its small warm circle, alone in the way that is not quite alone, and settles in for the duration, whatever the duration turns out to be. In the morning she rises before Owen and walks through the house in the first light, and comes to stand before the east wall of the front room, the oilskin and the notebooks replaced now in the cavity, the plaster fitted back over them, waiting for whenever they are next needed. She places her palm flat against the wall and holds it there a moment. The plaster is cool and smooth and ordinary under her hand. Then, very faintly, from the other side, the slow, even pressure of something pressing back. She leaves her hand where it is. There is nowhere she needs to be this morning that is more important than this small, ordinary gesture of acknowledgement between two things sharing the same ground, one of them mortal and fair-haired and recently married and standing in the early light of a Kansas spring morning, and the other, whatever it is, old and patient and entirely content, apparently, to simply press back. She stands there with her palm against the wall for a long while, feeling the faint, returning pressure of it, thinking about Margaret, who stood in the same spot on 10,000 similar mornings, thinking about the next entry she will write in her own new notebook tonight, thinking about nothing at all in particular, which is its own kind of thinking, the thinking of a person who has arrived somewhere they intend to remain, and is simply, for this one quiet morning, letting themselves be arrived.